I'm going to go over how intimate partner violence issues for our children and families have been of such concern in the family courts that ultimately we developed guidelines. So, one of the problems with intimate partner violence in family law cases is that we don't have consistent screening. And for mental health practitioners, we often rely upon our gut feelings. I can feel it, I know it, I don't think it is. We're not really being objective. And I think for lawyers, it becomes an issue because lawyers and mediators aren't necessarily evaluating for intimate partner violence, but they need to know if it is present or not. We also then tend to make very poor decisions because we don't have reliable or accurate information. And the services and the interventions that we have don't necessarily meet families' needs. So these are the issues. So we developed these guidelines for examining intimate partner violence. And the guidelines are a supplement to the model standards of practice for child custody evaluation. They don't stand on their own, really, but they provide kind of aspirational goals. When we're talking about intimate partner violence in these guidelines, we're taking a very broad kind of view, and we are including physical violence, sexual violence, economic violence, psychological violence, and coercive, controlling, aggressive behavior. We also are very attentive to context. What we know is that any of those behaviors can occur alone, they can occur in combination, and they're going to vary family by family. And we have to think about context. So what I mean by that is if there was physical violence, was there physical violence in an effort to control? Was it related to substance abuse? Was it related to an anger management problem? Was it related to an impulse control problem? Is it something that's gone on over time, or is it new and just in the context of the separation? When someone walks into a room and finds their husband in bed with their best friend, it's not, we don't advocate for violence, but it's not completely out of the realm of someone throwing something. But that then is intimate partner violence. So, but that has never happened before, and probably, maybe, will never happen again. So that's very different than a pattern of ongoing kind of violence. So the guiding principles are the following, that number one, that we prioritize the safety and well-being of children and parents. We need to ensure an informed, fair, and accountable process. And we use research-based interviewing techniques of adults and children, and we focus on the individual family. So we apply the research to an individual family. And we also then need to consider cultural kinds of differences when we're making our recommendations. So we don't make assumptions. The context differs from case to case. The impact differs from child to child, from parent to parent, and outcomes are going to differ from case to case. Taking a systematic approach is going to, and the systematic approach means we have a protocol, we generate multiple hypotheses, The guidelines that we have developed apply only to hypotheses related to IPV, so they're not hypotheses related to other things, which is really important to keep in mind as well. And we don't address other things. And one size does not fit all. So we have really sort of spent time thinking about 3 different models. So one of the models, the 5P framework, started with a book that Jan Johnston, Vivian Roseby, and Kathy Keenley wrote, but it was really much further developed after the Wingspread Conference. Was that in 07, I think, in 07. So the 5 Ps were looking at the potency of the violence, the pattern of the violence, the primary perpetrator of the violence, what kind of parenting problems emerged from that, and then the perspective of the child. Another model, which is one I really like because it's so simple, was developed by the Battered Women's Justice Project. And there are a lot of resources, by the way, on their website, BWJP. So their model basically is that you screen, you assess the full nature and context, you determine the effects on children, parenting, co-parenting, and you make recommendations that are really responsive to all of that. And you do it in a way that is safe, informed, systematic, and that is unbiased. And then the last model, which is really just an elaboration of the 5P model, is the one that was developed by Drozd and Austin. Looks at potency, including risk factors. It looks at the pattern of the violence, because we want to know, is this something that's about coercive control? Is this separation instigated? Is this kind of a mutual conflict kind of thing? Is it protective? Is it the result of substance abuse and mental illness? And then, most importantly to us, is how have the children been exposed to it and witnessed it, and how has that affected their well-being and adjustment, as well as parenting and co-parenting? So those first 2 guidelines of safety first, we know we have to prioritize the safety and the well-being. So it's not only a guiding principle, it is our very first guideline. And when the report is written, so sort of anticipating and planning for any heightened risk. I have a postdoc who just sent me a report to review, and I wrote back and said, we can't send this to the attorneys. We have to write a letter to the judge and say we're very concerned about, we don't know what will happen, we can't predict that, but we have a concern about how in this case the father, who's had 3 deployments in Afghanistan and PTSD, and has some serious problems, is going to respond when he sees the report. So we're thinking safety and risk even when we're finished, when we're thinking about what's going to happen to it. Screening is not an assessment. Think about screening across discipline. And screening is just asking the kind of general questions about, like, who makes decisions and how are decisions made. It's an ongoing process that should be occurring in mediation, evaluation, therapy, or as counsel as well. So an effective screening protocol is structured. It considers multiple forms of IPV. It considers physical, sexual, economic, coercive, controlling, threats and actions. Screening has to promote safe and informed disclosure. We have good research which tells us that if people don't feel safe, they're not going to disclose. We have good research that tells us that if we don't ask behaviorally specific questions, we're not going to get information. We have to make certain that we have provided informed consent about what happens if there is a disclosure. And those of us who are mental health professionals have to report anything that suggests abuse or neglect. So we have to make sure that people know what we're going to do with the information. Whether it's reportable or not, how does it go into a report to the court if you're an evaluator? This is one of my favorite screening guides. It contains all of the elements of an effective screening protocol. But those 7 questions, which I use now every parenting coordination case I do. This is how I meet with each person individually first. I do that 7-question screen as part of what I do. Otherwise, I really don't know what's going on with that family. If screening indicates IPV is going to be an issue, then we perform a separate assessment, and that's what the rest of the guidelines follow about how do you gather the information, analyze the information, and synthesize the information. This sort of takes those first 5 guidelines, safe, informed, systematic, and unbiased. There are a lot of challenges to gathering information in any custody evaluation. But when there is IPV, it makes it even more challenging. There's often a lack of documentation. How often do you do an evaluation where we've determined there's been IPV and you've got hospital emergency room records? Rarely. Sometimes. How often are there police records? Sometimes, but not always. There often is either an absence of past violence, so then what's the meaning of the recent violence, and what's the meaning relative to parenting and co-parenting? What are some of the reactions of children? Some children have no reactions. Other children have real trauma reactions. Some of those trauma reactions last for a long time. Why? Because they've been exposed to violence, or because they're living with a cycle of fear and anxiety. So we're collecting information about IPV in general and the impact on the children. The children may not have been exposed to in a direct way, but how often has there been IPV and children don't know about it, even when parents say, no, they never saw it, they never heard it? Rarely. Kids usually know. So what we're trying to figure out is a full understanding of the events and circumstances that may have occurred, including the nature of the aggression, the frequency, severity, and context, whether one or both parties are responsible, and the various risk factors. These are some risk factors that we have to be attentive to throughout the evaluation. When there are high levels or increases in violence or injury, that's a risk factor. When there are threats, there are lethality means, that is a huge risk factor. When there is excessive control, jealousy, or obsession, risk factor. And unwillingness to accept responsibility for the abuse. Now, how do we differentiate unwillingness to accept responsibility for abuse from it didn't happen? Psychological or substance problems. And I want to say that the psychological problem that is the biggest risk factor for violence is command hallucinations.
What is that?
Command hallucination is when I'm psychotic and I've got a voice in my head or I'm seeing something. Command delusions or hallucinations, telling me that I have to kill so-and-so to save the world, to save my children. Information about the child. So what we're looking at is the child's experiences of past and current IPV. We want to know how and when. So we're looking at, they're not going to know. I love it when I've got a child who comes in and says, my daddy kicked my mommy when she was pregnant. Really? How do you know that? I remember. Children will be exposed by direct and indirect observation. Some children try to intervene. They try to distract. Some children are harmed themselves when there's violence between parents. Some see a sibling being abused. Some see the effects or aftermath of abuse. It could be a black eye. It could be scratches. It could be that the police come. It could be that now daddy's in the hospital. If a child has been chronically exposed to domestic violence, that affects brain development. We know that the limbic system and the linkage, the cortisol drip from an aroused limbic system results in brain damage, changes in brain functioning. We can see behavioral problems, emotional problems, attention. When kids can't pay attention in school, they don't always have ADHD. Health-related, intimate partner violence, divorce, there are 10 different things that are associated with shorter lifespan and health-related problems, this being one of them. And it also can have a social or economic impact on the child. What we can't forget here is some kids are resilient. That somewhere between 35 and 50% of children do as well as any other children. So we're looking at the influence on children based on, again, the nature of the violence, the age of the child, because younger kids show higher levels of emotional and psychological distress. And we know that because they don't have the cognitive ability to understand what's going on. They're just trapped in it. We're going to see that anxiety, the closer the violence is to now, the more anxious and fearful they may be. We know that boys and girls react differently. Boys have more externalizing, aggressive behaviors. Girls have more internalizing, mood kind of behaviors. So then we're also collecting information about parenting and co-parenting. And one of the things we are thinking about is what are the common problematic parenting behaviors among abusers. And one is we know that they will use the child as a tool. They may undermine the other parent's ability to parent. They may try to undermine the other parent's relationship with the child. And they may continue to harass, even through email, the parent or the child. How about victim parenting? How is that effective if there is a victim? So one of the things we know is that they may be monitoring their children more, which may look like restrictive gatekeeping. We need information about co-parenting, because we need to know how can we create a structure where there's safe involvement between parents. So we're collecting all this information, right? And then we have to develop and test our hypotheses. How do we do that? Well, we organize the issues into themes and clusters, but throughout we're trying to avoid bias. If we have just one hypothesis, it's going to be supported. We're going to collect data to support that hypothesis. So that confirmatory bias. And so we reach a conclusion before we've collected all our information. We can't do that. We have to have those multiple kinds of hypotheses. So what are our goals for recommendations? To make sure that the physical and emotional safety, economic security of the children and parents who are subjected to IPV are prioritized. Safety, safety, safety. To minimize opportunities for and the risk of post-separation abuse tactics, harassment. Support autonomy as much as possible. And we're going to be addressing access arrangements, decision-making. We might offer a progressive plan with benchmarks to step it up. We're going to make recommendations about treatment or other interventions. And we always want a process for monitoring and enforceability. The point is, to have very specific kinds of expectations for parental behavior which lead to modifying an access plan. So when do we lift restrictions if we have them? Well, obviously when there's no threat of violence. When there is a credible report, not someone saying I did it, of progress or completion of a treatment that was focused on the issue at hand. Not, I went to therapy for 6 months and did diddly squat, or had my therapist listen to all my complaints. That's not what we're talking about, right? Where children are prepared, where there's appropriate reunification treatment with information about boundaries, expectations, reporting. Where the parent can focus on the child, protect the child, promote the recovery of the child, and accept responsibility for the harm that may have been caused. Basically, what we want is, right, the best, safe, functional relationships and living circumstances for families. We want to be able to use fair, gender-neutral, systematic processes, avoid our personal biases and beliefs, our assumptions, which we may not even know exist. We want to use a systematic decision-making model that includes complete, accurate information, multiple sources of data with multiple hypotheses, and we want to be able to provide recommendations for families that are specific, that are behavioral as needed, and that have a process for evolution. What has to be in place for that to happen? So all of that is kind of what the guidelines try to address. What do you have to do, first of all, in every case to screen? And then if the bell rings, bingo, and we think there may be IPV, what do we do to find out about it? And what do we do with the information that we have?
Robin Dutch.